The Allies of Humanity, Book 2, by Marshall V. Summers. Fourth Briefing, The Collectives. Societies exist in the greater community at every conceivable level of social and spiritual development. This ranges from pre-agricultural societies all the way up to empires, collectives, and other kinds of organizations established between nations for mutual defense and trade. At every level of this evolution, there are countless expressions. Yet, as we have said, there are vast regions of the galaxy that are unexplored and sparsely populated, where many societies live in secret. And there are many cultures that have never even been discovered. In our previous discourse, we gave the analogy of the galaxy being linked together with a series of routes, like a road map in your world. There are major avenues of travel, there are secondary avenues of travel, and there are areas where no roads exist at all. The impressions that we would like to give you regarding the greater community are most relevant to your position in space and are most descriptive of the environments that are in close proximity to your world. Parts of the galaxy that are far from areas of large congregations of inhabited worlds will seem very empty and devoid of life. Yet your range of vision is still extremely limited, and you cannot see beyond the closest planets even in your solar system. Your attempts at radio communication are futile, because no one uses this kind of technology for interplanetary communication. Travel in the universe is greatly accelerated by your standards, but is still very slow, given the enormity of the physical landscape. Large empires and collectives can only extend themselves where they have established an infrastructure nearby. Managing distant outposts is very difficult logistically, and has other hazards regarding the intervention of other races, as well as problems with regional jurisdictions and disputes. For this reason, in sparsely populated areas of the galaxy, the collectives will not be found. Even large empires may rarely send resource explorers to these regions, for they are far too distant, and even if discoveries could be made, the logistical problems in sending supplies and gaining access to these resources are formidable. To complicate the matter further, in more populated areas in the galaxy there are regional rules of conduct. So nations are really not that free to move anywhere they want to go in their explorations. Of course, we cannot expect the human family to understand this. Your current perspective is that the universe is really there to be explored and to be taken for your own advantage. But alas, you are not the first ones to arrive here. And there are many civilizations and empires that are far older than anything that humanity has established so far on Earth. Wars and great conflicts do occur in the universe, but they are relatively rare. Rebellions and internal disputes are more common, but wars between large nations and empires in the universe are far more rare than you might think. We cannot speak for other galaxies, for we have never ventured there, but from what we know of this galaxy and of our own travels, we know these things to be quite true. Humanity is still discovering many secrets about technology, and so this is where it places its hope and its promise. However, amongst more advanced nations, power of influence in the mental environment is the far greater arena of influence. For, as we have said, technology can be purchased and copied. That is not where the real advantages will usually be found. However, resources are valuable, and therefore the destruction of resources is generally looked on with disfavor. It is better to persuade a race to come into alliance with you than to try to overtake them by force. The collectives certainly understand this. It is also understood by many more advanced civilizations who have learned through much trial and error and through many difficult periods in the history of their worlds that this is most certainly true. As societies become more technologically advanced, the need for resources is greater, and the preservation of natural resources becomes a greater emphasis. In many cases, home worlds have outstripped their own world's resources, even to the point where these worlds have become barren and unproductive. This gives evidence as to why your world is viewed with such great interest among those few races, relatively speaking, who are aware of it. Biologically rich, rich in resources, strategically important, and accessible to many of the collectives who live in this part of the galaxy, it is a true prize. Your proximity to areas that are fairly well inhabited holds both a disadvantage and an advantage for you. The disadvantage, of course, is that your world will be recognized and is being recognized and is within reach of collectives, which are but one form of social structure in the universe. The advantage for you, however, is that your world cannot be conquered. For you live in a region that is very governed by rules of conduct. If your world existed in a very remote part of the galaxy, where such rules of conduct were not established, then your world could be taken by force. It could be taken by resource explorers, by pirates, by large nation-states, by anyone who could gain access to it and maintain control and authority. So the fact that you live in a more, shall we say, civilized part of the universe does give you some degree of protection. In this region, where we also dwell, it is illegal for a new world such as yours to be invaded without the permission of the indigenous race. This means that your world cannot become a part of a larger association unless humanity demonstrates visibly that it agrees to this and that it welcomes intervention. Because the greater community, especially the area in which you live, is a very competitive environment, and because there are many collectives dwelling here, they tend to hold each other in check and will take legal action against one another if necessary, should the basic rules of conduct be violated. Therefore, if one collective sought to take this world by force, it would be countered by other collectives who have an interest in this world and by their competitors elsewhere, who would hold these kinds of actions in check. We cannot expect you to understand the details of such a complex situation, but it is important for you to know that the universe around you is not empty and void of life. It is important for you to know that the universe near your shores is not primitive and unregulated. This will help you understand how the collectives that are involved in your world function and how they can be counteracted. This gives you certain advantages, which you must learn to recognize and to employ on your own behalf. There are other parts of the universe where great empires exist, and they set their own rules, having few competitors within their regions. And there are many other areas where many nations have joined together in associations, either economic, political, or military, or all three, for their mutual trade and defense. These are quite common in areas that are well inhabited in the universe. The region in which you live, which encompasses, by your reckoning, a very vast area, contains approximately 5,000 stars. We call this a region because that is how it is delineated. This is a very small part of the galaxy, as you can imagine, but quite large in terms of your interests and needs. In this region, there are important rules of conduct. You have small empires, some of which you would call dictatorships, and some of which are more democratic in nature. You have collectives, which are quite powerful but limited in certain areas of their influence. Any areas that are connected by main thoroughfares of trade are ruled by codes and councils. This is to provide safety and security and to assure that violence does not erupt and grow into all-out warfare. Disputes occur frequently and are handled either through negotiations or through legal procedures. However, these governing bodies only oversee trade routes primarily, and they are supported by organizations of states that belong to them for their own mutual benefit and security. Some of these organizations are stronger than others, yet where you have larger competing powers, the rules of conduct are taken quite seriously and are enforced quite seriously. In the region in which your world exists, collectives are not allowed to have armies or military forces. They are allowed to have security forces, however, for their own defense. Being primarily economic institutions, they do seek to protect their interests and their avenues of trade with their own forces, but they do not have large armies such as you might imagine. They may hire security forces when traveling in areas that are considered unsafe for trade or politically unstable between resident nations, but essentially, collectives, which we would like to take some time to describe now, are not military powers. They are economic powers. Their focus is on trade, resource acquisition, and building their alliance amongst worlds such as your own. There are many collectives functioning in the region in which your world exists. Some of these collectives are centered within this region. Some have centers elsewhere and have major satellite establishments here. It is an interesting fact of life that wherever collectives exist and compete with each other nations have established their own defenses against the collectives so that the collectives cannot intervene in these worlds' trade, commerce, and internal affairs. Because we are talking about many nations within a region, many of which have their own military establishments, the collectives then must abide by certain rules of conduct or face very grave consequences. Being without significant weaponry of their own, they must utilize negotiations, diplomacy, and influence as their primary means of accomplishment. Therefore, who you are encountering in the universe at this time represent highly organized, very hierarchical organizations whose function is resource acquisition and development. Collectives, by and large, are made up of a series of races functioning at different levels of authority and command. Those who really control the collectives that are functioning in your world have probably not been encountered by anyone in the world yet. You have only recognized the worker classes who are bred to serve in specific functions. Though they are biological entities, their biological codes, their training, their upbringing, and their genetic focus have given them very little individuality and individual abilities of reasoning and discernment. They function very much like, a collective mind. They are rigidly controlled. They have little or no personal freedom. Their areas of function are very specific and are carried out with impressive efficiency. Yet collectives are inherently weak because they are not built on what we call knowledge. Therefore, they do not have the strength of insight. They are not creative in their approaches. They tend to mimic one another. They rely upon their structure, their codes of conduct, and their ability to manipulate the thoughts and feelings of not only their members, but of those races whom they seek to influence. While they are very powerful in certain respects, they do have inherent weaknesses. Throughout history, collectives have had great difficulty in maintaining control and authority over their resident populations because they comprise many different racial groups. The worker classes are bred to serve, but even they have certain qualities that the ruling classes of the collectives find difficult to manage. Revolts have occurred, and collectives have suffered great losses as a result. They are most certainly imperfect, but more fundamentally, they are not governed by knowledge or the power of spirit. This means that their defenses can be penetrated, their secrets can be uncovered, their activities can be revealed, and their deceptions can be comprehended by those who are strong with knowledge and who are free to see, to know, and to act. Other nations and regions such as yours deal with the collectives very, very carefully and do not allow them any kind of penetration into their world's internal affairs. Sometimes the collectives are viewed as a necessary evil to provide essential resources that are needed by these worlds. The collectives have great craft and great skill in the areas in which they are strong. And nations which have been able to interact with them successfully have had to maintain a significant distance and be extremely discreet. Certainly interventions, such as the one happening in your world, would not be allowed by any race that understood its true interests and the realities of life in the universe. The fact that the intervention is well underway in your world demonstrates that humanity does not have this awareness and does not have the unity or the social cohesion to resist and to offset unwarranted and unwanted visitations such as this. We have been told that there are great economic organizations that have interests all around your globe and that employ different nations and different groups in service to these organizations. Perhaps this can serve then as an example. But collectives are far larger. They may encompass hundreds of worlds and planetary establishments and exist beyond vast reaches of space. They can have significant control and are always interested in gaining new allegiances and new members. Collectives are but one form of social structure in the universe. Collectives vary amongst themselves. Some are purely economic and secular in their establishment, focus, theory, and philosophy. Others have religious components. However, having religious components does not mean that they are religious in nature. It simply means that part of their philosophy encompasses spirituality, to whatever degree spiritual awareness exists in their members, and speaks to this and directs the spiritual awareness or interest, particularly amongst its ruling classes. Yet we have found with very few exceptions that collectives consider their own survival and their own structure to be the sole focus of their devotion. Their devotion is almost religious in nature, even though their organizations rarely are. If they were strong with knowledge, they would not be collectives. Fundamentally, a collective is different from an empire in that it has no source home planet. It is a group of planets that are dissimilar that have joined together, usually through conquest and persuasion, and have become a formidable economic force. Whereas an empire is usually centered in one world or in one region by one race, collectives are made up of many different races. We have never been able to penetrate the hierarchy of a collective, and so we cannot speak to the composition of its leadership in terms of their racial background. But we know that they are diverse, and that they manage their diversity with a strict code of ethics and a hierarchical control that you would find totally oppressive. Certainly, we could not live within such a society, although in our cases, we came very close to having to do so. True democracy, as you would call it, exists in the universe, even in great manifestations, but it is far more rare than you might think. And certainly any true democracy would have to become very strong in its dealings with the greater community, very careful to avoid, if possible, interactions with collectives and other aggressive kinds of empires. There is no one empire in the universe that is predominant. There is too much diversity and life. There is too much competition. And there have been long-standing disputes between certain nations. Advanced technology is abundant amongst many societies, so the advantages sought are not technological in nature. Though some nations are richer than others, defenses have become formidable in the universe against violent intrusion. Here again the collectives have certain kinds of advantages in that they do not use force. They do not rely upon a military presence to achieve their goals. Our native worlds all exist either within the region of your world or nearby. We have all had to deal with collectives. We have all had to deal with resource explorers from other nations. We have all had to learn to protect and secure our freedom and to become as self-sufficient as possible, in many cases relying upon one another for essential resources for our survival and well-being. The more self-sufficient a world can become, and the more it can sustain this self-sufficiency, the stronger, more independent it will be by nature in the universe. Often nations become dependent upon collectives because they have exhausted their fundamental resources and must now rely upon trade and commerce for the very basic things they need to live. This, of course, makes them extremely vulnerable to usurpation, and in many cases they become parts of collectives themselves or extremely dependent upon them. With the deterioration of your natural environment and the rapid depletion of your essential resources, you are moving into a position of extreme vulnerability and powerlessness in the universe. This must become part of your understanding. There is little or no awareness of the realities of life, commerce, and manipulation in the universe amongst your people, even amongst your governments and leaders. We have learned much from your transmissions, and we have learned much from the unseen ones. Your world, in many respects, has problems common to emerging and developing life throughout the universe. You have an inherent interest, then, in maintaining and sustaining your world's fundamental resources and in regenerating these resources successfully. Without this, the collectives will have a great advantage in their inducements. Without this, even if you resisted the collectives, eventually you would need what they have to offer: raw materials, energy, food production, advanced technology. All of these things create a state of dependency, either to a collective or to many other kinds of states, nations, and organizations that are directly involved in trade and commerce. Clearly, your world would be at a great disadvantage if it could not bargain successfully for the very things that it needs. It would have to accept whatever terms are presented to it eventually. The outcome of this then becomes obvious. You are incorporated into other worlds' infrastructure, whether it be a collective, an empire, or an aggressive association of worlds, all of whom are always looking for new territory and new resources. The unseen ones have told us in response to our first set of discourses that many people feel helpless and hopeless in the face of encountering all of these things. We understand this. We faced such thresholds ourselves, with very grave consequences, because we did not prepare in time. However, as we have said, and must continue to emphasize, humanity does have the power and the skill to stop the intervention and to prevent future interventions of this kind. You have inherent knowledge that lives within you. This is what we mean by spirituality. You have enough individual power and enough technology to offset the kind of intervention that is occurring in your world at this time. You could drive the visitors out if you had the will to do it, but you must become educated about the greater community, and you must be very clear and sober about what you are dealing with at this time. That is why our counsel is so important, if you can receive it. Part of the inducement of the intervention is to discourage those who are aware of its real nature. In other words, for those individuals who become aware of the intervention, the focus of the visitors then will be to demoralize and to discourage them, to make them feel weak, helpless, and impotent in its face, to make them think that they are being visited by enormous powers with unlimited strength, and that they have absolutely no possibility of resisting the visitor's persuasion or offsetting the visitor's presence in the world. This is but part of the manipulation that is being perpetrated. For those who seem cooperative and receptive, the glorious benefits of collaborating with the visitors will be emphasized. For those who are doubtful about these things or cannot be persuaded, then discouragement and demoralization will be the primary influence. Here then, it is necessary for you to understand that your own sense of weakness and helplessness is not merely a product of your lack of self-trust, but is actually part of the manipulation that is being cast in your mental environment. We understand that the governments of your world encourage their populations to feel weak and dependent upon their government structure and authority. But we are talking about a greater and more pervasive kind of influence here. Humanity will succumb, either because it is persuaded to do so, or because it is discouraged from resisting. These are two forms of manipulation with a common goal. Therefore, you must not lose faith. You must learn about life in the greater community. You have strengths and you have weaknesses. The collectives have strengths and they have weaknesses. Your position in the universe has advantages and disadvantages. You also have allies who want to see human freedom protected and who want to see humanity emerge into the greater community as a free and united and protected world. We support this everywhere, for this is the true spiritual inclination. In the universe in which you live, there are formidable forces of opposition against this, but there are powerful forces that keep it alive and encourage it and nurture it wherever that can be accomplished. Therefore, understand that if you feel weak and helpless and overwhelmed, part of this feeling comes from the intervention itself. Here you must gain great confidence in the inherent goodness of humanity and recognize the real value of your freedom. You have never been challenged like this before. Your freedom has never been challenged as a race, as a people, as a world like this before. Yet everyone in the world can value even the possibility of freedom, and whatever freedom they may have at this moment. It is all at risk now. This is where you find your common unity, and this is where you heal your conflicts and your ancient animosities between one another. And you settle your scores because now they do not matter. What matters is the preservation of human freedom and your preeminence in your own world. What matters now is the preservation of your world's resources for your own future survival and security. What matters now is that you recognize the intervention and take the necessary steps to thwart it and to stop it. This must happen at every level of your societies, at the level of government, religion, and the will of the common people. There are great spiritual forces in the world we know who support this and who encourage it. Yet their influence and their voices can be overshadowed by the effects of the intervention and by the ignorance of people themselves. In our worlds, emissaries were sent nearby to advise us as to impending danger that we faced from the infiltration of foreign powers into our worlds. We were being seduced, as you are being seduced, to join in mutual benefits of trade and commerce. And those of us who were skeptical and those of us who resisted such a persuasion were alienated from our societies, and were dissuaded and discouraged and demoralized to a point where we could not have the governing voice, where we could not represent the will of the people. If your people simply want little trinkets from the universe, new technological toys to play with, and you would give away your freedom and your autonomy for this, then certainly our words will not be enough. But the education must start somewhere. And it must reach those people who already have a sensitivity to the greater community. It must reach those people who value human freedom and do not take it for granted. It must reach those people who have already been affected by the intervention, either directly or indirectly. It must begin somewhere. And as we have said, our words are but part of the preparation. You need to know you have allies in the greater community, but you also need to know that it will be human strength and human cooperation that will turn the tide in your favor. We cannot intervene beyond giving you our counsel. You must understand without ambivalence and confusion the real nature and purpose of the intervention in the world today. At this moment, your allies are not present in the world. They are not walking the face of your world. They are not dwelling in your world. They are not influencing your governments and people in positions of power. They are not contacting your sensitives and your psychics. They are not trying to persuade those who are religious in their views. We speak for your true allies, and our counsel is to give you perspective and understanding and sobriety to help you offset the influences that are being cast upon you and have been cast upon you now for decades. You have the power to resist. You have the power to unite. You have the power to cast off this influence. The collectives do not believe you will resist, and so they are less careful than perhaps they should be in influencing you. They think this project will be time-consuming but easy, and that the ultimate goal will be achieved without great difficulty. We must then speak to those people who are ready and able to respond. There is no other problem or dilemma in your life as critical as this. Anything that you establish on your behalf or for your nation or your group or your culture or your religious tradition will be lost in the face of the intervention. You do not want to be part of a collective. You must trust us in this regard and consider our words seriously. There is no freedom there. You will become nothing but servants bonded to your new masters. And though those of you who represent your masters will have certain privileges, you will all be enslaved. And the power then to resist, though it can still be mustered, will have much greater costs and consequences. To those governing powers observing the collectives who are intervening in your world, it must appear to them that humanity welcomes the presence of the collectives. It must appear from the outside that humanity is in favor of this intervention, and that is why there is such a great effort to secure emissaries for the visitors and have individuals in positions of power and leadership advocate for the presence of the visitors, and to affirm the visitors' promises of greater wealth, power, freedom, and peace. Can you understand what we are telling you here? This is a deception, both within your world and beyond. Until there is a strong voice resisting the intervention that is made known and public, it will appear to outside observers that the intervention is being welcomed by humanity and is being advocated by humanity. Already, the intervention has many speakers and representatives, but few vocal critics. Even your vocal criticism creates problems for the intervention, even for people to speak out and say, "No, this is wrong. We are being visited against our will. We are being persuaded and manipulated against our will. This must not happen. We do not welcome this, and we demand that the visitors leave." Until these voices are heard, it will appear to governing bodies and to those who compete with these collectives that they are here with human consent. Even to arouse a public outcry would have great benefit here for you. It is not that you have to physically remove the visitors. You have to demonstrate your displeasure with their presence and with their activities. And you have to demonstrate sobriety regarding their inducements and their deceptions. And you have to speak out against their attempt to interbreed with humanity to create a new leadership here. And you have to speak out against the abduction of people against their will. For these things are being carried out in secret. Even outside authorities do not know this is happening. We must keep emphasizing these things so that you can see and understand clearly. Raise your voice against the intervention, and the intervention is put at risk. Resist the intervention, and the intervention must stop, and the collectives must find other ways to gain your attention and your allegiance. As we said in our previous discourses, no one should be setting foot on your soil without your expressed consent. And your allies would not come here without this expressed consent, even though at an earlier time your allies did attempt to reach certain individuals in the world in the face of the intervention. Yet, generally speaking, no true ally of humanity would intervene in human affairs unless humanity as a whole spoke on behalf of this. And this could not be the product of persuasion or manipulation or deception, but must be the product of your honest understanding of your condition and your need for assistance. Do not think you can speak to those workers in the collectives whom you will most likely meet in your face-to-face encounters. They have not the discernment or the will to understand your perspective. They are only carrying out their duties as they have been bred to do. Though they are biological beings and still have the potential for spirit, the likelihood of you being able to persuade them is very, very limited. They are functioning mindlessly. They do not have the moral foundation you have. Personal freedom is unknown to them, and they do not value it, having been taught that personal freedom is chaotic, unruly, and destructive. They would not accept your pleas and your admonitions. And even those who manage and control them, though having greater authority, they themselves will not be able to comprehend your complaint or your persuasions. This is not how the intervention will be stopped. It will not be stopped by your creating dissension amongst its ranks. It will be stopped because you have created a voice against it, and your people are united in preventing it from happening in the world. At this moment, alien craft come and go at will. People are taken at will. Biological resources are taken at will. Access to individuals in positions of power are made at will. There is not the collective consent and resistance necessary to offset any of these intrusions, any of these violations of your fundamental rights. This must change. And it must start with someone. It must start with you and with others like you, who have a greater awareness and sensitivity, and who can respond to a message such as ours, and who have the inner trust to know that we are speaking the truth. We have much more to impart to you.